Hello, everyone. In this lecture, we will be discussing solvency ratios. So while there are many solvency ratios, we are going to focus on two in particular, the debt to asset ratio and the debt to equity ratio. So as indicated in previous lectures, there are several ratios that management and investors and stakeholders and even employees use to measure the health and stability of an organization. And in this lecture, we will be focusing in on solvency ratios. So solvency ratios, what are they? They are a key metric used to measure a company's ability to meet its long-term debt obligations. And sometimes they are also referred to as leverage ratios, and it tells you how a company uses its debt. These ratios are typically used by lenders to measure the creditworthiness of a company, and it can also be used by potential investors. And again, it measures the financial health of a company to determine how financially stable a company is. And to calculate the solvency ratios, all of the information comes from the balance sheet. So here we're looking at Intel's balance sheet. So the calculation is total debt divided by total assets. So when I add up the total debt for Intel, which is total current liabilities and everything thereunder, I get to a total of 72,053, and I divide that by the total assets, which is 153,091, which indicates that Intel has a debt to asset ratio of 0.47. So what I've done is the calculations for, well, this should be 2019 and 2018. Well, 2019, it was 0.43. So that number is going up, it's increasing. And what does that mean? Well, the higher the ratio, the higher the risk. And it indicates that a company uses its debts to finance its assets. Typically, rule of thumb, a good ratio, debt to asset ratio is between 0.3 and 0.6. However, that is industry specific. So the way to really measure whether a company has a good or bad debt to asset ratio is to compare it to another company within the same industry. So on this screen, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to look at Intel versus IBM and their debt to asset ratio. So both of these companies are reporting in millions. The years are, we're comparing the same years. But as you can see, Intel has a lower debt to asset ratio than IBM. Right? So even though that their revenues are pretty much on the same level, this is showing me that Intel is using much more debt than Intel, right? So the higher that number gets, it's not a good thing. You know, 0.3 to 0.6 are good indicators of a good debt to asset ratio, but again, it's industry specific. So next we're going to look at debt to equity, and the calculation takes the total liabilities divided by the total equity. So for total liabilities, we've taken these line items, and that gives us our total liabilities, which is 72,053, and we're going to divide that by the total equity, which is on the balance sheet at 81,038. So in 2020, the debt to equity ratio for Intel was 0.89, and in 2019 it was 0.76. So what does this mean? This means how much debt that the company has for every dollar of shareholders' equity. And just as in the debt to asset ratio, the higher the ratio, the higher the risk. Anything higher than 2.0 is not considered a good debt to equity ratio. But just like with debt to asset ratio, it's best to compare this with another company within the same industry. So that's what we're going to do with IBM. And now if you look at this, this is a staggering difference. So basically IBM, has 6 times more debt than it does in equity. But on the other hand, a low debt to equity ratio, excuse me, can also be an indication of a buyout, right? So you'd have to be doing some reading and researching on these companies to find out what the heck is going on. And as we stated in earlier videos, the numbers do not tell the entire story. So we can look at these ratios, we can calculate these ratios, but we'd have to do much more research to find out what's going on behind the scenes in terms of other areas of the organization. So solvency ratios are another key metric used to measure a company's ability to meet its long-term debt obligations. So remember, we had long-term debt and current debt. Solvency ratios look at the long-term debt. It's used by lenders to measure the creditworthiness of a company. Industry averages should be taken into consideration. So where I gave you 0.3 to 0.6 is a good debt to asset ratio. The best way to really look at that is to compare another company within the same industry. The higher the ratio indicates a company uses its debts to finance its assets, which is not a good thing. It's not something that investors and lenders and stakeholders would be too happy about.